it is 6 o'clock. I know people are still filtering in, so we'll get some additions here as we go, but I just did want to get going because I don't want to intrude on everyone's time. I don't want to run too far over, and we have a lot of great conversation to come. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Elizabeth Schultz. I am a senior political science major at Westchester University. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight on our panel discussion about the topic of Pennsylvania's closed primary election system. I will be moderating tonight's event, which is being hosted in collaboration with the Westchester University Student Government Association. The purpose of this event is to raise awareness for the issue of closed primary elections, particularly ahead of the upcoming May 18th primaries in Pennsylvania, as many of you are probably aware. We are fortunate to have a really outstanding group of experienced panelists here to help us accomplish this purpose of raising awareness. And I'm sure that you'll all gain some really valuable insight from them, as I already have as well in my private conversations with them. But before I introduce our panelists, I would like to briefly mention the formatting of our meeting, as well as some basic Zoom rules of engagement.
Cool. Do you think you could take me down?
So our agenda is, as I said, pretty packed tonight. So we want to keep things running.
You can just pause it.
Yeah, let me just move there. The way things will run is after I introduce our panelists and I give some background information on our topic, we're going to jump right into our panelist discussion. So following the panelist discussion, two of our panelists are going to briefly share with us the work that they're doing at the national and state levels to promote inclusive primary elections. And then I will also share just briefly some of the work that my PASHE student peers and I have been engaging in. So with any remaining time at the end of the call, we will open up for questions from the audience. But if we run out of time, which is entirely possible, I will put my email in the chat, and I would ask the audience to submit any questions that they didn't get answered tonight to my email, and then I'll get back to you as soon as possible after the call. So for our Zoom rules tonight, please ensure that if you're not a panelist, your microphone is muted at all times, other than if you're asking a question, of course, in that open audience Q&A if we have time at the end. Also, please note that we are recording tonight's event, so if that impacts whether or not you'd like to keep your camera on, make sure you take that into consideration. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our four esteemed panelists who were gracious enough to make time out of their busy schedules to be here tonight. We have four panelists. The first one that I'll introduce is Mr. Jeremy Gruber. Jeremy is the Senior Vice President at Open Primaries, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to election reform. He is a lawyer, writer, and public policy advocate who has helped enact over 60 state, federal, and international laws and regulations. These include the successful passage of the first U.S. civil rights law in over 20 years, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, otherwise known as GINA. He's also helped pass Alaska's recent nonpartisan primary, Measure 2. He has also testified before U.S. Congress, the FDA, and numerous state, federal, and international legislative and regulatory bodies. He's worked for several civil rights organizations, including the ACLU, and is regularly featured in the media, as well as the author of 3 books. So thank you, Jeremy, for joining us this evening. Our second panelist is Mr. Alan Novak. Mr. Novak's political career began in Chester County, Pennsylvania as the Coatesville area GOP committeeman. He served as Coatesville City Councilman for 4 years and was subsequently elected Chester County GOP chair. Alan's leadership extended to the state level when he was selected to chair Pennsylvania's Republican Party from 1996 to 2005. As one of the longest serving chairmen, Alan was regularly recognized on the politicspa.com Power 50 list as one of the 50 most politically powerful Pennsylvanians. His experience has led him to be tapped as political advisor to Governors Tom Ridge, Mark Schweiker, and Tom Corbett. On the national scene, Alan served on presidential campaigns for President George W. Bush, as well as the Bush-Cheney transition team, and also served President Bush as a White House Fellows Commissioner. He is trained as a lawyer, and Alan brings a critical eye to discussion and debate. He has provided key analysis on shows like CNN, Fox News, ABC, MSNBC, Pennsylvania Cable News Network, and Philadelphia television and radio shows. Alan is the founder and president of Novak Strategic Advisors and co-founder of the Rooney Novak Eisenhower Group. He currently serves on the board of Independence Health Group Advisory Board for Public Policy and External Affairs, and formerly served on the board of Independence Blue Cross. Alan is a director of Mid-Penn Bank, and he's the former chair of both the Pennsylvania Racehorse Commission and the Board of Trustees of Ursinus College. Thank you, Mr. Novak, for joining us as well. It's an honor.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And our next panelist is Mr. TJ Rooney. He is the founder and president of Tri-State Strategies PA and the co-founder and senior partner of the Rooney Novak Eisenhower Group. Mr. Rooney began his political career in 1992 when he was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives in the 133rd District. He served for 7 consecutive terms from and served as a member on the Rules, Consumer Affairs, and Insurance Committees. In 2003, Mr. Rooney assumed leadership of the Pennsylvania House Democratic Campaign Committee, where he distinguished himself as a prolific fundraiser and astute strategist. Mr. Rooney's success there led him to key political positions statewide and nationally. Some of his notable roles include as senior advisor to Tom Wolf for governor campaign and the chair to the Insurance Committee for Wolf's transition team. He was the key advisor to former governor and national DNC chairman Ed Rendell, who then selected him to chair the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, where he served with distinction from 2003 to 2010. In 2004, he became the president of the Pennsylvania Electoral College. He was a 9-year member of the Democratic National Committee and also was the senior advisor to the Pennsylvania presidential campaigns of Al Gore, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama. I'd also like to note that Mr. Rooney and his partner, Mr. Alan Novak, who's here with us tonight, were honored as the first recipients of the 2017 Allegheny College Prize for Civility and Public Life in Pennsylvania in recognition of their work in navigating divisions in government to build consensus and end stalemates. Mr. Rooney is a favorite of statewide political news outlets as well as Philadelphia talk show radio programs. He shares a column on Pennsylvania politics with Mr. Novak, his longtime friend and political rival, which appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Mr. Rooney and Mr. Novak regularly lecture aspiring political science students at institutions such as University of Pennsylvania, St. Joseph's University, and Dickinson College. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Rooney. And our final panelist tonight, last but not least, is Ms. Jennifer Bullock. Jennifer is a licensed professional counselor with a master's in law and social policy as well as education. She's a longtime community activist, youth advocate, and psychotherapist. Her passionate commitment is to advance wellness for individuals, groups, communities, and our political system, which she notes is quite sick. She is the founder of Independent Pennsylvanians, a grassroots activist association working to strengthen the influence of independence in Pennsylvania. Independent Pennsylvanians is the PA affiliate of independentvoting.org, a national strategy center working to connect and empower the over 40% of Americans who self-identify as independents. For 15 years, she and her team of concerned citizens have advocated for fair and democratic elections that do not exclude independents. She has an unwavering commitment to demanding voting rights for all, challenging the two-party stranglehold on our elections. The signature campaign of Independent Pennsylvanians has been to open PA primaries to non-affiliated voters. Independent Pennsylvanians is a proud member of Open Primaries PA and the Open Primaries National Group. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us. So obviously, this is a great group of panelists that is well equipped to speak on our topic tonight. They each have very lengthy, incredible backgrounds in politics and advocacy work. So I'm thrilled that we were able to corral you all this expertise under one Zoom roof tonight. But before I start hurling questions your way, I want to give any audience member who may not be familiar with the concept of primary elections and what they look like in PA, a little bit of a brief background on the topic. So the first question is, what is a primary election and why do we have them? The purpose of primary elections is to function as a candidate selection process for political parties. So primaries help to narrow down a political party's candidates in order for the winning candidates to then square off in the general election. So in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a movement to give more power to citizens in the selection of candidates for a party's nomination, and the primary election model kind of developed from this reform movement. There are a plethora of different ways in which a primary election can be run. In Pennsylvania, we do use the closed primary system, hence the name of this panel tonight. In a closed system, voters must register with a party in order to participate in the party's candidate selection process. So in other words, Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans, and unaffiliated voters get excluded from participating altogether. So it is important to note, though, that all voters can vote on constitutional amendments, ballot questions, and any special election contests that are held at the same time as primary elections, even in a closed system. So our upcoming election on the 18th, I believe, does have, I think it's 3 constitutional amendments that they're considering. So for any independent voters in the audience, do keep that in mind. But PA is one of only 9 states that continues to use a closed primary election model. In other states, primary election laws vary quite dramatically. Without getting too far into the weeds, I did want to note that most primary models do fall under one of the following systems that you see on the slide here. These are open, closed, top two, and kind of hybrid models. So that includes elections that are open to unaffiliated voters, as well as the closed and semi-open models. So to kind of gloss over them a little bit, open primaries are where voters may cast a ballot in either party's primary without registering for a party. So this model gives voters the most flexibility, obviously, because, for example, if a Republican candidate decided that they preferred to support a Democratic candidate in a particular election or vice versa, they may do so without officially changing their party affiliation. So this model also allows independent voters to freely participate in the candidate selection process. And states that use this model include Alabama, Illinois, Texas, Vermont. You can kind of see from that map there on the screen. And so while this open primary system does give the greatest amount of freedom for voters, there also are some critiques of this model, the largest one being the fear of a practice known as cross-party rating. And so this is when a member of a rival political party could cross lines to cast their ballot for the opposition candidate that they feel is the weakest. So the logic here is that they believe that their own party would then have a better chance of defeating this weaker candidate from the other party later on in the general election. So while rating is possible in open primary models, data shows us that this is fairly rare, as voters on average prefer to use their votes to support their preferred candidate. The other models that we were going to kind of gloss over here is the closed primary model, which we've already explained a little bit. Obviously, that's the model that Pennsylvania uses. And kind of some of the critiques here are that the closed primary model enables basically a concentrated partisan constituency group to have a larger impact on the selection of candidates that will then run in the general election, because we are closed off to moderate voters at this point. Historically, primary elections, only a small amount of voters from each party will come out anyway. So it tends to be this really small group of voters from a specific party that is then able to nominate the candidates that the entire state votes on later. And of course, since primary elections are funded using taxpayer money, taxpaying voters without party affiliation are excluded from elections that they help fund in the closed primary model. Then the final critique really is that the closed primary model does close off and limit voter participation, as they exclude an entire section of voters from being able to show up for them. And under the other section, these top two and hybrid models, the top two, to give like a brief example, is used in California and Washington. And this is a type of primary where all candidates are listed on the same primary ballot, and the top two vote getters, regardless of their affiliation, advance to the general election. So this most important feature is that these candidates are not separated by a political party on the ballot. So it is possible that two candidates from the same political party will move on to the general election. So the criticism here for this model is often that the voting choice in the general election may be between two candidates that are from the same party. And so the other hybrid models, we won't get too far into them, but the semi-open, semi-closed, they're very similar. They have just a few, functional or technical variations. But in PA, we have seen a push towards a transition for a hybrid model that would allow unaffiliated voters to choose which party that they could vote in, while voters registered with a party, the Democratic or Republican Party, would still vote with their own parties. So in other words, Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans, but unaffiliated voters then get to decide which party's primary they would like to vote in. So this solution kind of offers this middle ground between exclusion of independent voters in a closed primary and kind of this free-for-all of the open primaries. So this type of primary also eliminates those concerns about rating that we spoke about earlier. So in this past legislative session in Pennsylvania, we have seen significant movement on this issue. Senate Bill 300 was proposed to enact change for state primaries to allow these independent voters to participate. And to give you a little glimpse of that movement, I'm going to play a short video for you, courtesy of Independent Pennsylvanians and Open Primaries PA, which actually features all four of our panelists. So let me just get that shared real quickly. And I promise I won't talk this much the whole time. We will hear from our panelists shortly.
Isn't working. This is not working the way it needs to work.
Pennsylvania is a closed primary state.
Independent voters in Pennsylvania have long wanted to vote in the primaries.
I'm an independent. I don't want to join a party, and I shouldn't have to.
180,000 unaffiliated residents cannot vote in primary elections in Pennsylvania.
Independents want to vote. They register, they pay taxes, they want to vote, and that has to change. We have to open the primary so that independents have full and equal voting rights.
People are forced to pick a party, and I think a lot of politicians are hearing complaints from their constituents about that.
A bipartisan bill introduced by Democratic leader Jay Costa and Republican leader Joe Scarnati would allow unaffiliated voters to choose a primary to vote in.
Senate Bill 300 is a bill that basically allows those that are registered independent to vote in the primaries. I introduced this bill because what I've seen over the years is the fact that less and less people are voting in primaries. Sometimes 15, 16% of each party goes out and votes. And what we are seeing is this extremism from both parties. And I think it's certainly a step to help bring back democracy.
I think it's important that we have as many folks as possible participating in our primaries.
I think it should be open. I shouldn't be locked into my party.
Open primaries. I think it will give people an opportunity to vote their conscience, vote their interests.
I think they should be open to everybody. It's a public election.
People should be able to vote in the primaries however they register.
We need our voices heard.
It's a great idea.
Everyone should be able to be involved, because everyone should be able to decide who the leadership of their communities and their country are.
The bill received a hearing this past week in the Senate State Government Committee.
As public officials, we should do all we can to encourage voting. And it irritates me that independents can't vote in those elections.
If we are going to allow the parties to remain the gatekeepers of our primary elections, then they should be open to every tax-paying citizen. If taxation without representation is the very encapsulation of that founding principle.
I support opening the primary to independent and unaffiliated voters. Candidates and parties will be better. Probably 14 years ago would not be saying what I'm saying today. That's the freedom that comes with not being a party chairman anymore.
If I had uttered these words 10 years ago, my pants would have caught on fire and my tongue would have fallen out of my head. But it's true, this isn't working. This is not working the way it needs to work. So these initiatives to bring more people in and include them is clearly the right way to go. The more people we exclude from the process is just going to expedite the demise of political parties in Pennsylvania and across America.
All right. So there you saw all of our panelists kind of in action. This was a video obviously from a few years ago. So we'll talk a little bit more about Senate Bill 300, which was highlighted in that video a little bit later in our questions. But I do want, now that everyone has a little bit of a background, we're going to move into the panel discussion portion of the event. So starting with a question on the topic of independent voters for our panel. So according to data from the Pennsylvania Department of State's voter registration archive, between 2015 and 2019, the number of voters who declared third-party affiliation or no affiliation upon registration increased by about 8.7%, which makes this the fastest growing segment of voters in Pennsylvania. As of November 2020, the number of voters in this group has risen to 1.3 million, and close to 900,000 of those voters are those who we refer to as independent voters, as they do not affiliate with any party. Data also shows us that roughly half of millennials self-identify as independent voters, and you can see all of these statistics here on the screen. To our panel, what do these trends mean for a state with a closed primary election system, and how can or should our primary election system and political parties react to these statistics? Okay. And I'll toss that one over to Jennifer first, because I know she's eager to speak about independent.
Great. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Is there a way that we can go all on gallery view for a second? So how long can the two parties ignore these trends, right? Closed primaries benefit the parties, but as we'll be talking in more depth tonight, they do not benefit voters, and I would argue politicians. And Independent Pennsylvanian sees our shut out of primaries as fundamentally a voting rights issue. So the reason why I wanted to go on gallery is, can you raise your hand if you agree that voting rights are essential to a healthy democracy? Okay. So we can all collectively be outraged that our access to our engagement to elections is controlled by the two parties, and that independents, who are real people, who are consciously deciding not to be a part of either party, are shut out. Here's an example of how we, and you know, I'm a therapist as well as an activist, so I'm always thinking about, as Elizabeth said, and great job, Elizabeth, about how if your voting rights are limited or restricted, how that impacts on our wellness individually and in our communities and our democracy, because then we're erased as existing. Tonight, before this panel, I just put out a quick note on social media. Fellow independents, throw out some sentences as to why you think primaries should be opened. And I just got 3 and they kept coming in, but I had to get on the call. My voice is just as important as those of Democrats and Republicans. No government has the right to deny a citizen a voice or a vote. No taxation without representation. So we're working to humanize us independents who are saying we are not going to comply with the two-party system, which is outdated. This is why young people do not, you know, are more and more independent, because it's outdated and not innovative and not creative. And we have to find a new way to open up the system so that the fastest growing segment of voters can participate.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'd like to kind of pry a little bit at Mr. Novak and Mr. Rooney, because of course you have a lot of experience with parties in Pennsylvania. You know, what does this closed primary model in the face of these trends that we're seeing with independent voters mean for the political parties? You know, does this mean that we will see, you know, parties lose power within Pennsylvania, or, you know, what does this kind of mean for the parties themselves and their the way that they connect with their voter bases?
I don't know.
You want me to go first, or you want to go first?
It doesn't matter. I mean, I just view the issue. I am a Democrat. Proud Democrat. I'm not so proud of the system that, you know, we all compete or don't compete. I do think, however, that as a means to grow the Democratic Party, it's imperative that we independents and bring them into the fold. Think about it. Just think politics and set it aside for a moment if we can, and just think about human nature. You know, independents are going to go someplace. They're going to want to vote, and you're going to want to attract them as a candidate. And I'd rather be in front of that curve than behind that curve. I think it's a substantial way. I mean, the numbers you've recited, Elizabeth, and thank you for this opportunity. It's amazing that you were able to put this all together. So kudos to you. But I do still view things from a partisan lens very frequently. Maybe not as frequently as I used to, but I still do. And I view the future of the Democratic Party in part wedded to the notion that we become a bigger party, a more inclusive party. And so there's the practical political reality. But then what Joe Scarnati said, I think, is 100% spot on. it will bring moderation to our politics. If we can't get districts that are configured in such a way that moderation flourishes, then we're going to have to bring it about some other way. Because I've been that partisan person, and I get it. But when you're that partisan person, you tend not to get stuff done. And in Pennsylvania and in America, we're not getting enough stuff done. I think it's for reasons I won't pontificate on any longer. But suffice it to say, I think the future of the Democratic Party is indeed wedded to the notion that we get behind empowering independents to vote in primaries.
Yeah, and I would echo what TJ said, and I'll start with, I think the trend of increasing independent voters is going to continue to increase. I do not see it reversing. I see each party losing depending on the popularity of the party at the time or the person who represents the party at the time. But at the end of the day, the independent or unaffiliated numbers are going to continue to climb. And as a proud Republican, proud of the service I gave to my party, and proud of what we're doing now, TJ and I, in being very open-minded and trying to balance our partisan affiliation and our partisan loyalty with what's good for our communities and our country. We have stepped out on a number of issues, and this is one of them. And I believe the future of the Republican Party will also lie in the ability to attract unaffiliated or independent voters. Because after all, and I said this recently to a local elected official here in Chester County, I personally believe the economy or people's personal economics drive every election, but I think independents decide every election, at least in my county. And in Chester County, we're a 40-40-20 county. So the independents are going to drive every election in Chester County. And I think the parties put themselves in boxes. And I agree with TJ and certainly Joe Scarnati when he said the only way parties will moderate and candidates emerging from elections representing those parties will moderate in their governing will come with open primaries. Because then, in essence, a general election campaign has to be waged to win a primary, because you're going to be having more and more moderate voters or voters that don't draw themselves into a partisan box and sometimes an extreme partisan box. So I think it's better for the parties as well as better for the Commonwealth and the country and our democracy to open up the primaries.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And so moving on to our next question, this is actually about partisanship in Pennsylvania. So we did speak a little bit to it, but given the extreme dominance of the Republican and Democratic parties in general election races in the country, once a party selects their primary election winners, there really is an extremely high probability that either the Democratic or Republican candidate will go on to win the seat for which they primaried. Meanwhile, the turnout for primary elections is notoriously low, as primary elections have a tendency to be viewed as these unimportant or inconsequential elections. However, when we consider the small base of voters who are participating in the candidate selection process in a closed primary state like Pennsylvania, each primary election voter's decision theoretically has this increased weight in the primary. So under the understanding that small groups of Republicans and Democrats voters are largely responsible for selecting the candidates that all Pennsylvanians then choose between in the general election, what are the impacts regarding candidate quality and partisanship level in the state? More generally, in what ways has the closed primary system contributed to this political gridlock and partisanship in Pennsylvania governance? And I also did want to kind of broaden this question a little bit. Perhaps, Jeremy, you can speak to this a little bit. In what ways has opening primary elections in other states, have we seen this alleviate any of these tensions? I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all.
Sure. I don't think you can talk about where we are until you really understand how we got here. So I think, like you mentioned, primary elections were a reform that came out of the progressive era. Before then, candidates were selected by the parties and the public didn't participate in the candidate selection process until the general election. So they are, and they continue to be, a reform. but they actually weren't adopted in large numbers until several decades later. So we've only really had primary elections since the middle of the 20th century. And they worked for a number of years because until about 20, 25 years ago, most Americans were members of one of the two major parties. And so they got to have full participation, and the system largely worked, even though, you know, candidates were siloed by party and voters were siloed in terms of their ability to vote. Everybody was participating. That has changed dramatically because voter registration has changed across the board. We've seen a paradigm shift in terms of how voters are registering. So now registered independent voters are the largest or second largest group of registered voters in half the states in the country. At current rates of growth, and you were mentioning how they are the fastest growing group of voters in the country, they will be the largest or second largest group of voters in almost every state of the country in the next 15 years. So the whole system is cracking up. The whole system is out of whack because a larger and larger segment of voters are unable to participate. That matters because the general election, and we haven't talked about this yet, but the general elections have become highly, highly uncompetitive in this country. In the 2020 general election in Pennsylvania, about 5% of Senate races were considered competitive, and about 10% of House races were considered competitive. So the vast majority of races, the candidates were not decided in the general election, they were decided in the primary, and yet we're seeing in so many states, those numbers, by the way, are very similar in terms of competitiveness in states around the country. So we're seeing that the primaries have become the election that matters. The general election no longer functions as a competitive environment, and a large and very much growing segment of the public is shut out. So that's cracking up the whole system. And you're seeing smaller and smaller groups of voters who are choosing the candidates that then go on to a general election where they win, before the general election even happens. And so what you're seeing is a crack up of the whole system. You're seeing more and more partisanship coming out of the candidates because they're only beholden to tiny segments of the public anymore, right? In the primary election, the only election that matters, only a small number of people are deciding. That's why the whole term primaried, right? I'm sure you've all, if you follow the news lately, the whole issue of being primaried has become such a large part of the lexicon over the last several years. And that's because you can now primary people within the party who don't follow the party line, right? Who don't toe the party's agenda. And that's having a very conservatizing effect on all candidates, both in the Democratic and Republican parties alike. And we're seeing an inability to anybody to work across the aisle, anybody to be productive. We're seeing a total slowdown in legislative productivity. States that do have open primaries, we're seeing a large and growing amount of participation. The more open the state primary, the higher the participation goes up. Colorado adopted open primaries similar to what Pennsylvania is considering in 2016. In 2020, they had 8 times the number of voter participation they did in the prior election. You're seeing a lot more legislative productivity, a lot more bipartisanship. It is possible to reform the system, but it's going to be difficult. There's a lot to do.
Thank you for that outstanding insight. I'm going to move on to our third question topic, and this is about election funding and taxation. And I know that, Jeremy, this is another area that you're passionate about, but all panelists are, of course, welcome to answer these, any question that's asked. So at a glance, when the average Democratic or Republican voter shows up to participate in a primary election versus a general election in the state of Pennsylvania, their experience looks quite similar. The voting booths, the location, and other details may appear to be similar or the same. However, as we know, primary elections and general elections are fundamentally different in the way that they run in our state. In a primary election, voters are participating in a private process run by 2 private political parties, which allows the parties to act as gatekeepers for polling access. Although the parties in Pennsylvania are able to exclude various other groups from their candidate selection process, these same groups that are being excluded are also helping to fund these events. Pennsylvania's tax dollars keep primary elections in the state running, yet unaffiliated voters who pay these taxes are excluded from participation. Can you offer your thoughts and reactions to this arrangement and elaborate on the way that our state elections are funded?
Just a quick reminder, we all know that people died in the fight around no taxation without representation. That's not a wonky policy issue.
Absolutely. And I'll open it to our other panelists as well, if you'd like to comment on our the arrangement for funding of primaries.
Well, I think the situation gets resolved if everyone can vote in a primary. It's just unfair to have a essentially closed system funded publicly and money that everybody pays in the way of taxes, regardless of affiliated party or unaffiliated party. Only those that are registered to the party can vote in the process. It's just fundamentally unfair.
I mean, there's a fundamental tension going on right now in the way our primaries are run, right? The parties have spent a lot of time arguing in court that they're private organizations. They have First Amendment associational rights, and they should be able to decide how they conduct primaries. At the same time, they're more than willing to accept public monies to conduct those primaries and be the gatekeepers of deciding who can and can't participate. So there's a tension between those two concepts, and that has to be resolved. It's certainly the situation right now is not able to continue with the ever increasing number of independent voters. Now the number of voters who can participate is decreasing, while the number who can't is increasing. That again, it's an issue, like Jennifer said, it's an issue, and Alan said, it's an issue of fundamental fairness and fundamental democracy. If these are publicly funded elections, then everyone deserves a right to vote in them.
Wonderful. And just as a sort of a follow-up to this question, do any of you as panelists, think it's realistic if someone were to kind of retort, if the parties were to, completely fund their own elections, do you think that's something that could ever happen in Pennsylvania as, a way to counter this, taxation without representation argument? Or do you think, we would never see that happen and we'll continue to see the status quo of public monies without full public participation?
That we have problems now. Just think about what would happen if we moved to a system whereby we had parties have to pay. I mean, I can just imagine what it would. We have fundamental ballot access issues to begin with. I mean, full stop. Could you imagine what you get whacked to try to get on the ballot in certain unnamed places in Pennsylvania? What it would cost you? I mean, like, so if you want to further remove people, regular people from the process, that would be a surefire way to do it. I mean, the obvious way it's gotten around is because of what I think you said from the jump, Elizabeth. There are ballot questions that are on, that are going to be decided, and independents and non-affiliated voters can vote for ballot. That's how you kind of get around it all. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a wise thing, but it's the thing. And if you were to move to have the parties pick up the tab, they might run a little bit more efficiently. Maybe they'd be a little less wasteful in spending in some areas. But my God, you absolutely exclude a person with a good idea and a good heart and a good mind from being able to engage in the process unless they had a fat checkbook. And that's definitely no way to run it.
Yeah. I just think the parties would be better if they had to think, and the candidates would be better if in a primary they had to think that they had to have a message that appeals to voters that are the type of voters that vote in a general election. And by definition, I would say that independents are the kind of voters that if they were voting in a primary, the candidates would have to have a more general election type message and strategy, which I believe would improve the candidates and the parties, both sides of the aisle. I just believe that the more you get closer to general election thinking earlier in the process, the better the quality of the candidates, the campaign, the issues that matter, the whole outcome.
You know, one thing, Elizabeth, it's worth noting that you didn't cover in your sort of forms of open primaries is that Pennsylvania could have open primaries tomorrow, right? Both political parties have an absolute constitutional right to open their primaries to independent voters. The Supreme Court has well settled that question, and other state parties, both Republican and Democrat, have done so. So the only legal hurdle between Pennsylvania and having open primaries is the party's unwillingness to give up some control in place of, in exchange for some more democracy and more voter rights. Because it's really that simple. They could make that decision tomorrow and the legislature would have to follow.
And the more that control is held on to, the more that not only we are in peril, but the parties are in peril because it's restrictive across the board. So,
well,
we really...
That's a really interesting point because TJ and I talk about this all the time. And this pains us. We were party chairs at a time when in each of our parties, the state committee mattered. And looking back on it, it hasn't been that long ago from when we did this, but we talk all the time with each other about how the parties are less relevant. I mean, they have this controlled system, but at the end of the day, endorsements aren't mattering as much as they used to matter. The parties don't control money like they used to because of all of the ways that money is now siloed into congressional campaigns and and Senate campaigns and federal money, state dollars. So as the party loses power, the only way to become relevant again is to appeal to a voter base broader than your party base.
Focus for a hot second. We tend, I think, to focus on the parties, meaning the state parties. But I can tell you without fear of contradiction that you might actually be able to get a state Democrat or Republican Party to do something along these lines. And that's where a lot of the focus, I think, in terms of the activism has been on the state parties. That's not where we need to focus. The federal party almost, I will say, controls this issue. So your federal representatives are as important, if not more important. And the reason I don't think, Alan, I'm giving away any trade secrets. In talking with people, sincere-minded people like Joe Scarnati on this issue, there was hope. And I know for a fact that there was some brewing consensus until the idea got run up the proverbial flagpole, and it wasn't such a sunny place where the flag ended up. So what I'm suggesting is the effort, the lobbying, the intense focus also needs to. We have to engage our federal officials because they're the ones that can help change the mind. Even DNC members. I mean, DNC members have changed. I mean, at least since I've been there, it's a little bit more of a transparent group compared to what it used to be. So like those men and women are also critically important in changing this dynamic, because I think you could almost get, I mean, my God, Scarnati controlled the Senate, and there's other fair-minded people who have or had titles that are all about this, but man, it went up, it got to the national committees, and it got beat to a pulp.
Thank you for that. And actually, this next question really relates to kind of the direction we're heading as far as primary election legislation and kind of how we move forward from here and how, how we can accomplish this change. So as we saw from that video clip earlier, in the most recent legislative session, former pro tempore of the Senate, Joe Scarnati, proposed this bill to amend Pennsylvania's primary election law, which would give unaffiliated voters the option to choose to participate in either the Republican or Democratic primary elections. So this bill, Senate Bill 300, as we know, was approved with overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate. I believe it was a 42-8 vote. And it moved to the PA House of Representatives where it died. With bipartisan support and passage in the Senate, why do you feel that we did not see Senate Bill 300 get fully passed? And what can we learn from this situation as far as where we take our advocacy? And do you feel that the goals of Senate Bill 300 were realistic for our state? And what is this hangup that we're seeing? And I open that to all panelists.
Well, I want to say good question. What happened? And our group is constantly talking about how us voters can be related to as actual human beings versus pawns in a chess game, strategizing behind closed doors. So that would be great to know what happened with overwhelming support in the Senate and then dying in the House, although a lot of us can probably guess.
I mean, what happened was, again, the White House called and they were in cahoot. I mean, they didn't agree on much. I mean, the DNC and Donald Trump didn't agree on a whole heck of a lot. They agreed on this, that it shouldn't happen.
I mean, the challenge in Pennsylvania is that most election reform in this country, real election reform today, is happening through ballot initiatives. And Pennsylvania doesn't have a ballot initiative process. So you have to go through the legislature in order to make this happen. And you're asking folks who've been elected in one system, who are comfortable with that system and the control that that system offers them, to vote for something else. That's a challenging ask under the best of circumstances. And as Mr. Rooney said, this is the issue of open primaries is one of those rare issues that even today, with all the differences that we have in our country, it's the one issue that seems to bring Republicans and Democrat leadership together in opposition, and that is opening the primaries. So we are seeing some efforts in other states to open the primaries through state legislatures, but it's a very tough process to hold. Pennsylvania is not unique by any stretch of the imagination.
What I would add is, at least I've noticed that there are there are a couple co-sponsor memos that I've noticed for opening up the primary. It looks like Senator Laughlin, Erie, and Representative Quinn from Delaware County. It looks like they're identical, the co-sponsor memos. So it looks like there's some conversation about companion bills. Senator Boscola has a bill out there. And I saw a co-sponsor memo from Representative Conklin from the State College area from Center County. So, I mean, the opportunity legislatively is there, but the goal is to build consensus. And while the fundamental fairness argument goes to those independent voters that shouldn't be shut out, the reason I keep coming back to it will be good for everybody that's a stakeholder in this, including the parties, is for the very reason that Joe Scarnati mentioned as one of his top reasons for introducing this. He sees the need, he saw the need as a leader to have more moderate members of his caucus and more moderate members of the Democrat caucus to work across the aisle. And I think that's a consequence of that's practical, that comes out of the same goal, which is fundamental fairness and taxpayer rights and just a better system. But I think the parties make a mistake when they think they will lose in this. TJ and I both believe the parties will be better for this because they will have to have better candidates and better messaging to appeal to independent voters. And in a county like the one I live, independents decide the elections.
Mhm. I so appreciate what you're saying and the emphasis on how a more open process would benefit parties, politicians, and voters. And I want to keep on underscoring that the voters and the increasingly large group of independent voters are already shut out. It's not just a fairness issue, it is a fundamental justice issue. And that is why us independents and concerned Democrats and Republicans, regular folks, have to keep on banding together and demand that the parties and the politicians within the parties respond, because we are already shut out and made invisible. Actual human beings who are actually deciding, I know I cannot vote in this important first round, and I'm still not going to change my party affiliation.
You know, I think part of this is also a fundamental misunderstanding on behalf of party leadership on who independent voters are. There's so much overuse in sort of the political culture of talking about independents as party leaners. And as a result, they're sort of diminished and they're sort of pushed to the side. They're going to vote Republican or Democrat. Well, of course they are. Those are the only two choices you have in a general election in this country. So of course, those are the two choices they're going to pick from, and they're largely going to pick one or the other. That's human nature. That doesn't mean that they aren't independent, that they don't want to join a party, and that they are operating and thinking in a different way. It's important to know that it's not just registration. If you look at the numbers of voters who, when polled, are asked how they see themselves, those numbers are even higher than independent voter registration. Gallup, for the first time this year, tracked over 50% of Americans see themselves as independent voters. So to me, that begs the question, not are independent voters party leaners, but how many party members are actually independent leaners who are registered with the party simply because that's the only way they know to be able to participate in the democratic process in this country.
And we know, thank you, Jeremy, and we know that through numbers, because in closed primary states, you have lower numbers of non-affiliated voters. And there's many people in independent Pennsylvanians who are still registered Democrat and Republican because they want to be able to participate in the primary, but are independent.
You know, I have a second home in Texas, and someday I will be a Texas resident, hopefully someday soon, because I love my place down there. You know, in Texas, when you register to vote, you don't register as a party. You just register. And then you go in and you ask to have either the Republican ballot or the Democrat ballot. And anybody can do that. So it isn't, there's this person that has to say, I'm independent, I'm not affiliated, I want to vote in the Democrat primary or the Republican primary. In Texas, everybody walks in and they choose which primary to vote in because they're all registered, and that's it, they're registered.
Exactly.
That's a great point. And it's not just Texas, 20 states have nonpartisan voter registration. So in 20 states, you are not a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, right? You may see yourself that way, but in terms of how the state registers you, you're just a voter. And quite frankly, I think that's a healthier way we should be viewing voters in this country.
Thank you, everyone. That was very insightful. I do want to be conscious of time. And so our final question really was just about, you know, how kind of reflecting on, you know, the state of our, you know, electoral democracy in Pennsylvania. And obviously you've all kind of spoken to this, that, you know, clearly there's some fundamental issues and flaws here. But I do just want to give all of our panelists any extra space if you had any final comments before we slide along to hear about Jennifer and Jeremy's advocacy work at the state and national level. And if there is nothing further that you'd like to add, we can move right along. All right. Well, Jeremy, it looks like the floor is yours to speak about your advocacy, and for anyone in the audience, we will be speaking about, you know, ways you can get involved with the work, the great work that Jennifer and Jeremy are doing as well.
Thanks, and I'll keep it short because I put a lot of information at the very top of the chat. But Open Primaries, we're a national nonprofit advocacy and public education organization. We work on open primaries campaigns around the country. We've worked on every open primaries campaign that has been in place over the last half a dozen years. And we were part of the Alaska campaign that was noted, the Colorado campaign that passed open primaries in 2016. We're working in Maine right now on legislation actually very similar to legislation being considered in Pennsylvania through the legislature to open the primaries. And we have committees around the country in dozens of states that are in various forms working to build efforts for open primaries, either in legislatures or at the ballot initiative process. You can go to openprimaries.org in the chat and learn more about what we do. If you want to get involved and work directly in Pennsylvania, you can go. I also put the link to Open Primaries PA's website that we're affiliated with to learn how to get involved. We also do quite a bit of public education and media work. I put our most recent report that talks all about the rise of independent voters, which we've been talking about quite a bit today, including a section on Pennsylvania. So I encourage you to look there. We're also developing a litigation strategy to identify opportunities to look at both the taxpayer funding issue, which we've talked about, as well as First Amendment issues of forced association in terms of how our primaries are held in this country. So we operate on a wide variety of areas, and we have a Zoom call coming up that I think a lot of folks in Pennsylvania might be interested in. It's this Tuesday. The registration link is in the chat. We're bringing together a fourth generation Republican from South Dakota and a rising progressive star in the Maine Democratic Party, Senator Chloe Maxman, together to talk about cross-partisan dialogue around the open primaries issue and ways both people from different parties and different locations have been working in their communities around this issue. So a lot of good stuff going on, both at the campaign level and the public education level. And I hope you come to our websites and get involved.
Wonderful. And Jennifer, did you want to speak a little bit to how folks can get involved with your work as well?
Sure. Well, you can go to our website, paindependence.org, where we have, all of our events and meetings and activities, ways to join our writing letters to the editor campaign. This is an important time of year for us, obviously, because May 18th primaries are coming up. We can't vote, ask us why. So we'll have a lot of social media buzz going on. You can wear our mission, People Over Parties, as I am. You can get that link on our website. And we're really excited because, as Alan mentioned, Senator Laughlin from Erie County is going to sponsor what was the same exact version of Senate Bill 300. It'll be a different number, and he's going to roll that out on primary day. So we'll have a press conference, and that's very exciting.
Wonderful. And I also did want to plug some of the work that PASHE students are doing. So I'm part of the Westchester University Student Government Association. We're joined by the president, former president of the Student Government Association, Molly Scolo, here tonight, and I believe a few others from our cohort. But we've worked really hard over the past year to kind of recognize the fact that, independent voters are largely young voters, and they're our generation, they're our peers. So this is something that, our age group is really passionate about, and we kind of wanted to show that through our work. So we have engaged in some grassroots advocacy with the help of Dr. Julie Dietrich, who's the External Relations Director at Westchester University, who's joining us here on the call. We've drafted some documents, including a letter and petition that will be sent out to all legislators in Pennsylvania, hopefully this summer. We're collecting signatures from other PASHE student governments as we speak. Our Westchester University Student Government Association has already signed on to it. We also have sent out a calling guide where we've matched all of our PASHE institutions with their corresponding representatives and senators, so that with a script involved as well, so everyone, all these students can feel comfortable reaching out to legislators on this issue, have kind of a guide as to how to even approach this, because of course, primaries, as we see, are very complex. They're hard to understand sometimes. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible to get our peers involved who are affected in more ways than one. So With that, I want to thank all of our panelists for coming out tonight. If any of you had anything to add here at the end, I know we only have about a minute left, for questions and things like that, but I open the floor to you panelists.
One thing I want to say with Independent Pennsylvanians is that we advocate for open primaries as one of a whole myriad of reforms that need to happen. So I know, Tim, you're asking about, well, what about third parties and ballot access reform? Ballot access reform has to happen. Gerrymandering has to stop. There are many issues that need to be addressed. The reason why we are passionate about open primaries is because we do see it as a fundamental voting rights issue. But that is not to negate that other significant changes also need to happen as an entire package.
I also just wanted to give a quick plug. We have a sister organization, Students for Open Primaries. I put the URL in the chat, studentsforopenprimaries.org. If you're a young person, as Elizabeth mentioned, millennials and Gen Zers are overwhelmingly registered independent. They're shut out in closed primaries. So please get involved with Students for Open Primaries if you're so inclined.
Elizabeth, I don't see the whole roster of folks, but I know we have some great elected officials that were kind enough to take the time on a Friday night to join us, including Representative Eric Nelson from Westmoreland County, one of the more thoughtful members of the General Assembly. Donna Gordy and others I know are on, but I just wanted to thank those folks. I can tell you firsthand from having done it for a long time, there's a lot of stuff you can do on a Friday night. So thanks to them.
Yeah, and I want to shout out the same thanks to Representative Eric Nelson. We really appreciate him coming on, and any of the other elected officials that did tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for your time. It's really so appreciated. And I know every voter in this call, will take this back with them. The call is recorded today. We've had a couple legislators already ask for the recording, so this will be sent out. We had a lot of interest from across the state. So I really, really appreciated that kind of feedback as a young voter, having that kind of support. So thank you, everyone. I did leave my email in the chat, so feel free if you had any questions. I know the chat was getting a little crazy here, and I apologize that we didn't have more time to answer some of these questions. But if you did want to get some responses, feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to follow up with you. And of course, use those resources that were dropped in the chat by our panelists. I'll stick around for a couple minutes after the call if anyone would like to just discuss anything that they heard today at the panel. But I'll release you all, and thank you so much for spending your Friday evening with us. So.